Welcome back to Crosstalk. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing if capitalism is doomed. I'd like to go back to Arun in New York. Okay, you were accused of dime store Marxism. Okay, well, you can respond to that when you want. But one thing is, gentlemen, one thing is undeniable is the income distribution in the United States and some extent in Europe now is getting worse and worse. We've never seen anything like it since the beginning of the Great Depression in 1929. Now, does that have something to do with the current model of capitalism? The rich just get richer and the poor just get poorer. Arun, go ahead.
Well, of course, if we look at the neoliberal turn in the 1970s, what's going on is that at that point, wealth and income had dropped to historic lows for the upper 1%, the upper 10%, the 0.1%. And so you have Reagan coming in the U.S., Thatcher coming in England, and you see a massive upward transfer of wealth. So, for example, by the mid-1970s, the top 1% of the population held about 20% of the wealth. That was a historic low. By the late 1980s, barely a decade later, it was up to 35%. And recently, we are now above Gilded Age levels. The 400 richest families in the country, in America, have more wealth than 50% of the population, than 150 million people. And we need to really understand, we can talk about the neoliberal moment in terms of deregulation, flexibilization, trade liberalization, personal responsibility. We can talk about the ideology and tools of it, but really what it is about a massive upward transfer of wealth, because even though the ideology is market fundamentalism, that government should not intervene in markets, government always intervenes in markets, and it depends on whose side they're intervening on. During the Keynesian moment, you did have some intervention on the side of labor, but now what it is, it's on the side of capital. So with all the various debt crises, such as the Mexican peso crisis in the 1980s, the East Asian financial crisis, and the credit crisis now, we see government intervening to aid corporations to ensure that bondholders are kept whole. That is what this is about. I think we need to do away with the fantasy of the free market that some in comfortable purchase like to peddle.
Okay, Richard, if I can go back to you in Bangkok, I mean, Arun brings up a very interesting point, is that governments around the world are propping up capitalism because capitalism is really to the benefit of corporations and not to labor and not to civil society in general. Is that how capitalism has changed, let's say, since the 1980s?
Well, during my lifetime, it seems to me that everyone's become much richer. Of course, the income disparity has become greater, but as credit has expanded to $50 trillion, that's created a great deal of wealth globally. The problem is now that debt on one side is an asset for someone else. And so when the debt begins to blow up, as it is now, it also destroys the assets. So the banking system is extremely vulnerable because its assets are being destroyed with the debt destruction. And if the credit begins to contract now, all of us are going to become very much poor, the rich and the poor. And so whatever kind of economic system we have now,
let's not forget that over 3 billion of people in the world live on less than $2 a day.
Arun, go ahead. Repeat. Go ahead.
I said, let's not forget that over 3 billion people in the world live on less than $2 a day. I think all this abstract talk actually forgets the reality of the extreme deprivation of the poverty, of the dispossession.
This is a very important
in Russia
point
itself, for example, that the life expectancy for a Russian male from the Soviet Union went from approximately 73 years old to 59 years old. What you're seeing is the destruction of people itself. When we talk about
there's a reverse trend. Arun,
commodities.
Thank goodness there's a reverse trend here. It's getting better. Okay. But I see your point.
But that's an extreme crash. That is unprecedented in human history for an industrialized country to achieve a drop in life expectancy outside of a war was unknown.
Absolutely
until
true.
the collapse of the Soviet Union.
And you can see why Russians are very sensitive about the 1990s because of the shock therapy that was practiced in this country, and people haven't forgotten it. Tom, you've been wanting to jump in. Go ahead.
This is a very important point that Arun brought up, but he's got it backwards. If we look at the percentage of the population that's living on $2 or $3 a day, it's abysmally high, but it's falling, and that is the key. It used to be that almost everyone, except for the tiny ruling elites who controlled the states, lived at such an abysmal level of poverty. That percentage has been falling as a percentage of world population. He mentioned the case of India. He said, well, still it's the case there are lots of poor. People in India have always
80%.
been poor. Wake up. And the question is, are they getting richer or poorer? That's the relevant question. Poverty is the natural state of mankind, and wealth has to be created. It's created by free market capitalism, by investment, by production, and by exchange. So if you want to look at India, the question is has it been changing since 1991 for better or for worse? And the question is unmistakable, for better. The same thing in China. I visit both countries.
All right, I'd like to change gears, gentlemen. I want to go back to Richard in Bangkok. Okay, let's look at the Great Contraction going back to 2008. I mean, the way I look at it is that we've seen banks bailed out, we have seen corporations bailed out. If we go to TARP in the United States, I mean, it's always the rich people being bailed out. Is that how capitalism is supposed to work? Because are these the people only creating jobs for the rest of us?
Well, again, I think that the government recognizes that whether it thinks that we have capitalism or not is irrelevant. It's clear that if they don't bail out the banks, and for that matter, the major automobile companies, that if the banks go bankrupt, it's going to destroy everyone's wealth. That $50 trillion I keep talking about would completely disappear, and we would all be hungry. So they had no choice. But no, this is not classical capitalism. But capitalism is based on a gold standard. The reason we had the Roaring '20s and the Great Depression is because the gold standard broke down in World War I and created a big credit bubble during the '20s. The same things happened this time. The gold standard broke down with the Bretton Woods system in 1971. It created a very long credit boom, and now that credit boom is blowing up, and we're likely to collapse into a new Great Depression unless we come up with some very clever new strategies to resolve this crisis.
Tom, what do you think about that? Because a lot of people say that the Western financial institutions, their toolbox is empty right now, that this Great Contraction is not like we've had recessions since the Second World War. There's something fundamentally wrong, and there has to be some fundamentally new answers to the problems that capitalism faces today. What would you say to that?
I'd say the first question is bailouts are not a feature of capitalism. It's not a feature of the free market that someone whose best friend is the Treasury Secretary gets a giant check like Goldman Sachs did. This is cronyism. It's pure, unadulterated cronyism that we're suffering from right now. Bailouts of the banks, bailouts of companies, the nationalization of General Motors by the American government, and what's happening in other countries around the world as well is cronyism. What we've seen is a real crisis of interventionism. If you ask what caused this crisis, sorry?
Would you have let them crash?
I absolutely would have let them fail.
Would you have let them collapse?
That's part of the
Would you have not
important
bailed
part
them out
about
if you were
a
in
market
charge?
economy is firms can rise if they produce value and satisfy customers, and they go out of business if they don't.
I agree with what Richard is saying.
Okay, Arun, I want to go to you. It looks like the system we have now is that we have capitalism for the rich, and we have nothing else for, we have socialism for the rich, and we have capitalism for the poor. How do you like that? Do you agree with that phrase or not?
I think that's a very accurate way of putting it, and I think that Richard brings up an important point in terms of, yes, something had to be done. What we see is free marketers like Tom peddle this ideology of burn the house down, let it burn down if that what happens. Now, what happened with the credit crisis is that the governments nationalized the losses. They should have actually nationalized the banks. It is in the public interest to have control over the credit system, and that could have easily been achieved. And this is the point I'm making, as we can see again and again and again. Bailouts are actually the norm. There have been hundreds of these financial crises, and with increasing frequency over the last 30 to 40 years under the neoliberal regime, and you have all sorts of bailout. The Mexican peso crisis was a massive bailout of the banks. Long-term capital management was a bailout. You have these these bailouts again and again and again, because the only other option is to let the economy crash, which would be extremely devastating. Now, the way the bailouts are structured, they're structured mainly for the benefit of the corporations and wealthy, and certainly some benefits trickle downwards in terms of that the credit system keeps pumping, but we need much more of a human-centered system rather than a profit-centered
system. That's a very good
system.
point. I'd like to go to Richard on this point here. What is the future of capitalism here? Because I think a lot of people would agree, irrespective of your ideological trajectory, is that it's reached a certain, critical mass. Obviously, we can't keep going on the way we are now. What needs to fundamentally change? Because you said that there is no capitalism, and if you're a proponent of that system, what needs to be done to bring it back online?
Right. I think, as I've said, we have a government-directed economy now to a very large extent through these bailouts and the government spending so much money. But in order to revert to something closer to economic orthodoxy that perhaps could ensure sustainable growth, what we need to do is we need to stop borrowing and consuming, and instead we need to borrow and invest. What I'd like to see, my fear is that if the credit begins to contract, then this economic system built on credit is going to implode. Therefore, how can we ensure that credit continues to expand, but it expands in a way that generates a productive return, rather than just borrowing and consuming as we've been doing for decades? I'd like to see the government borrow and invest. For example, I'd like to see the U.S. government borrow $1 trillion at 2% interest and develop solar energy over the next 10 years. Then that would be an investment that would yield returns for eternity. That would also pay for itself. We could bring down the budget deficit by $200 billion a year.
All right, I'm going to have to jump in here. Many thanks to my guests today in Washington, New York, and Bangkok. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, Crosstalk rules.